Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 14th, and we're looking back 174 years to November 14th, 1851. On that day, a book was published in New York that would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest novels ever written in English. The author was a 32-year-old former sailor named Herman Melville. The book was titled Moby-Dick, or The Whale. It opens with three simple words that have become among the most famous in literature: "Call me Ishmael." What follows is an epic tale of Captain Ahab's obsessive quest to hunt and kill a great white whale. But it's also much more than that. It's a philosophical meditation on fate, free will, and humanity's relationship with nature, an exploration of American democracy and capitalism, a technical manual on whaling, and a profound inquiry into the meaning of existence itself. When Moby-Dick was published in 1851, it was a commercial and critical failure. It sold poorly, confused reviewers, and essentially ended Melville's career as a novelist. He died in obscurity in 1891, believing himself a failure. Yet today, Moby-Dick is considered America's greatest novel, a masterwork of world literature, studied in schools and universities across the globe. The story of how a failed whaling novel became a canonical masterpiece tells us something important about art, genius, and how we recognize greatness, sometimes only after it's too late. To understand Moby-Dick, we need to understand Herman Melville's unusual path to writing it. Born in 1819 to a once prosperous New York family that fell into poverty after his father's business failures and early death, Melville had limited formal education. At age 20, with few prospects, he signed on as a crew member aboard a merchant ship bound for Liverpool. That voyage changed his life. Melville discovered he loved the sea, and over the next 4 years, he lived an adventurer's life that seems almost too exciting to be true. He sailed on a whaling ship to the South Pacific. He jumped ship in the Marquesas Islands and lived among indigenous people rumored to practice cannibalism. He joined a mutiny on an Australian whaler. He lived in Tahiti. He eventually joined the U.S. Navy and sailed home aboard a frigate. When Melville returned to America in 1844, he had lived experiences that most Americans could barely imagine. He turned those experiences into novels. His first book, Typee, based on his time in the Marquesas, was published in 1846 and became a bestseller. Americans were fascinated by his tales of South Pacific adventure and exotic peoples. He followed with Omu in 1847, another successful South Seas adventure. But Melville was growing artistically ambitious. He wanted to write more than entertaining adventure stories. He was reading voraciously Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible, philosophical works. He was developing ideas about art, truth, and the writer's responsibility. His next novels, Marty and Redburn, were more complex and experimental. They also sold poorly. His publishers urged him to return to simple adventure tales. Instead, Melville decided to write his masterpiece. Melville began writing Moby-Dick in early 1850. Initially, he conceived it as a relatively straightforward whaling adventure, the kind of book his publishers and readers expected. But as he wrote, The project grew more ambitious. He was inspired by his friendship with Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of The Scarlet Letter, who encouraged Melville's artistic ambitions. He was reading Shakespeare's tragedies and seeing how to combine entertainment with profound themes. And he was drawing on his experiences aboard whaling ships to create something that would be simultaneously an adventure story, a technical treatise, and a philosophical epic. The plot of Moby-Dick is deceptively simple. A young man named Ishmael signs onto a whaling ship called the Pequod. The ship's captain, Ahab, is monomaniacally obsessed with hunting a specific white sperm whale called Moby-Dick, who in a previous encounter destroyed Ahab's leg. Rather than conducting normal whaling operations for profit, Ahab drags his crew on a suicidal quest for revenge against the whale. The hunt takes them across the world's oceans. Ultimately, they find Moby-Dick, Ahab attacks, and the whale destroys the ship, killing everyone except Ishmael, who survives to tell the tale. But that straightforward plot is really just the framework for something much larger. Melville fills the novel with chapters on whale biology, the mechanics of whaling, philosophical meditations on whiteness and evil, discussions of fate and free will, and elaborate symbolism. Some chapters contain almost no plot advancement, just Ishmael reflecting on the meaning of a whale's head or the symbolism of different parts of the ship. The novel operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It's a thrilling adventure story about hunting a dangerous animal. It's a detailed, almost documentary account of 19th century whaling. It's a philosophical exploration of obsession, revenge, and humanity's place in nature. It's a critique of American capitalism and manifest destiny. It's a meditation on the limits of human knowledge and understanding. It's all these things at once. This complexity and ambition made Moby-Dick unlike anything else in American literature. And in 1851, most readers didn't know what to make of it. When Moby-Dick was published on November 14, 1851, initial reviews were mixed to negative. Some reviewers recognized its power and originality, but many were confused or dismissive. Why did a whaling adventure contain so much philosophy? Why were there long chapters about whale anatomy? Why was the plot interrupted by meditations on the color white or the nature of symbols? Readers who had enjoyed Melville's earlier South Seas adventures found Moby-Dick too difficult, too strange, too ambitious. Sales were poor. The book sold only about 3,000 copies during Melville's lifetime, barely enough to pay back his publisher's advance. For an author who had been a bestseller just a few years earlier, this was devastating. The commercial failure effectively ended Melville's career as a novelist. He wrote one more novel, Pierre, which was even more experimental and sold even worse. Critics savaged it. Publishers lost interest in Melville. He tried to make a living through magazine stories and poetry, but struggled financially. Eventually, he took a job as a customs inspector in New York, a position he held for nearly 20 years. He continued writing poetry for his own satisfaction, but he essentially vanished from the literary scene. When Melville died in 1891, his obituaries either ignored Moby-Dick or mentioned it briefly as a curiosity. He died believing himself a failed artist who had squandered early promise. The irony is almost unbearable. The author of what would be recognized as America's greatest novel died thinking he had wasted his talent. So how did Moby-Dick go from failed curiosity to canonical masterpiece? The transformation took decades and resulted from changing literary tastes and a new generation of critics who could appreciate what Melville had achieved. In the 1910s and 1920s, as modernist writers were experimenting with form and pushing the boundaries of what novels could do, critics began reconsidering 19th century American literature. They discovered Melville. They realized that Moby-Dick's experimental structure, its mixing of genres, its philosophical depth, and its symbolic richness made it remarkably modern. What had seemed like flaws in 1851, the digressions, the philosophical meditations, the departures from straightforward narrative, now seemed like innovations. The centenary of Melville's birth in 1919 sparked renewed interest. Literary scholars began writing about Moby-Dick, analyzing its themes and techniques. By the 1920s, it was being taught in universities. By the 1930s, it was considered a major American novel, and by mid-century, it had achieved its current status as perhaps the American novel, the book that most fully captures something essential about American experience, character, and mythology. This rediscovery transformed Melville from forgotten customs inspector to literary genius, but it came too late for him to know about it. His recognition was entirely posthumous. What makes Moby-Dick such an enduring masterpiece? Why do we still read, study, and reference this 170-year-old novel about an obsolete industry? First, it's a profound exploration of obsession. Captain Ahab's monomaniacal pursuit of the white whale that maimed him becomes a study in how single-minded fixation can destroy not just the obsessed person, but everyone around them. Ahab drags his entire crew, who signed on for a profitable whaling voyage, into his personal vendetta. His obsession makes him blind to reason, compassion, and even self-preservation. The novel asks, what happens when someone in power becomes consumed by a personal fixation? What responsibility do those around them have to resist or enable that obsession? Second, Moby-Dick is about humanity's relationship with nature. The whale represents something vast, powerful, and ultimately unknowable. Ahab believes he can dominate nature through will and violence. He sees the whale as evil incarnate, something to be destroyed. But the novel suggests nature is neither good nor evil, it simply is. Ahab's attempt to impose human meaning on the whale and to dominate it through violence leads to his destruction. This theme resonates powerfully today as we grapple with climate change and environmental destruction caused by humanity's attempts to dominate rather than coexist with nature. Third, the novel explores American capitalism and its human costs. Whaling in the 19th century was industrial capitalism at sea. Ships were floating factories. Whales were raw materials to be extracted and processed. Crews were labor to be exploited. The novel depicts this system in detail while also questioning its morality. The diverse crew of the Pequod, Americans, Europeans, Pacific Islanders, Africans, represents American democracy and the mixing of peoples. But they're all trapped in a hierarchical system where Ahab's obsession overrides their interests and ultimately kills them. Fourth, Moby-Dick grapples with questions of fate, free will, and the search for meaning. Are we masters of our destiny or caught in forces beyond our control? Can we truly understand the universe, or are there fundamental mysteries beyond human comprehension? The novel doesn't provide easy answers. Instead, it dramatizes these questions through Ahab's quest and Ishmael's reflections. Fifth, the book is simply a magnificent display of literary craft. Melville's prose ranges from straightforward narrative to soaring poetry to technical precision to philosophical meditation. He incorporates techniques from Shakespeare, the Bible, scientific texts, and adventure novels. He creates unforgettable characters, not just Ahab and Ishmael, but the first mate Starbuck, the harpooner Queequeg, and others. He builds suspense masterfully, making us wait hundreds of pages for the actual encounter with Moby-Dick, then delivering a thrilling climax. Moby-Dick continues to influence culture and provide metaphors for contemporary situations. We speak of someone's white whale to mean an obsessive quest. We reference Ahab when discussing leaders consumed by personal vendettas. The novel has inspired countless adaptations, references, and artistic responses, from films to operas to novels to songs. The book's themes feel particularly relevant in our current moment. We face leaders sometimes consumed by obsessions that harm their countries and constituents. We see the consequences of treating nature as something to be dominated rather than respected. We live in a capitalist system that sometimes sacrifices human well-being for profit. We struggle with questions about fate, free will, and finding meaning in a complex universe. The story of the book's reception also offers lessons about recognizing genius and innovation. The critics and readers of 1851 weren't stupid or malicious. They simply couldn't see what Melville had achieved because it was too different from what they expected. Genuinely original art often isn't recognized immediately. The standards and expectations of the present sometimes blind us to innovations that later generations will value. This should make us humble about our own judgments. What contemporary artists are we dismissing or ignoring who might be recognized as geniuses by future generations? What books being published today will be read in 2195? We probably can't identify them with certainty because truly original work often challenges our current assumptions about what's good or important. The novel also reminds us that commercial success and artistic value aren't the same thing. Moby-Dick failed in the marketplace, but succeeded as art. Many bestsellers of 1851 are completely forgotten today. The market is not a reliable judge of lasting value. This matters when we think about how we support artists and what work we preserve and promote. At the end of Moby-Dick, the Pequod is destroyed, Ahab is killed, and the entire crew perishes, except for Ishmael, who survives to tell the story. His survival and storytelling are significant. The novel begins with his voice and ends with his survival. He represents the witness, the one who observes and records without being consumed by Ahab's obsession. In a sense, Melville himself was like Ishmael, the survivor of a wreck who tells the tale. His career was destroyed, his ambitions seemingly sunk, but he survived, kept writing, and left behind a masterpiece that would eventually be recognized. He didn't live to see that recognition, which is tragic, but the work survived and eventually found its audience. That survival suggests something hopeful about art and truth. Great work sometimes survives despite initial rejection. Genuine innovation eventually finds appreciation, even if it takes decades or centuries. The marketplace and critics of the moment aren't the final judges. Quality and significance can persist even through long periods of neglect. On November 14, 1851, a failed whaling novel was published. It took 70 years for the world to realize it was a masterpiece. Herman Melville never knew his whale would live forever. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Moby-Dick reminds us that genius isn't always recognized in its time, that commercial success and artistic value are different things, and that the most challenging works often become the most enduring. Understanding how we failed to appreciate Melville's achievement in 1851 should make us more open to innovation and more humble about our contemporary judgments. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Richard Backus, and I'll be back tomorrow with another story from our shared past.